Good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give everyone a couple minutes to make sure that everyone who signed up is able to log into the webinar, and we'll be starting shortly. Thank you for your patience. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another one of our surely now world famous Wednesday night webinars with the World Affairs Council of Maine. And tonight we're going to delve into a subject that has long been central to US foreign policy, been on the minds of US presidents, and today is so important that it didn't even come up in last Thursday's Foreign Policy Forum. And that, of course, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the question of Palestine, and the pursuit of peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. We're really fortunate to have with us tonight. Our guest is Khaled Elgindy. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he directs their program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He's also the author of The Blind Spot, Palestine, The Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, which is one of the few, if not only, thorough investigations of US perceptions of Palestinians and relations with the Palestinians, really since the beginning of US engagement with the conflict. He wrote this book while he was a fellow in the foreign policy program at the Brookings Institution, and also has firsthand experience with the subject matter. Between 2004 and 2009, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership in Ramallah on permanent status negotiations with Israel. And he was a key participant in the Annapolis negotiations that took place during the second Bush administration between 2007 and 2008. Thank you, Khaled, for being with us this evening. I really appreciate you coming to speak to our membership.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, as I mentioned, last Thursday, we had our big fall foreign policy forum. We invited four retired US ambassadors who live in Maine, including Robert Ford, who is a fellow at the Middle East Institute. And the purpose was to lay out all of the short and long-term strategic challenges facing the United States right now, what's on the administration's agenda, and 70 minutes of remarks, 20 minutes of audience question and answer. Israel, Palestine, the Middle East just didn't come up. And I wasn't that surprised, and I don't think it's really an oversight. The Biden administration hasn't even appointed a special envoy. I don't even think the peace process was mentioned when he was in Saudi Arabia. Is it fair to say that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, after at least 75 years, is no longer a strategic priority or of strategic significance to the United States?
It's a very good question, and if it ever was, is part of the answer. I think the question of whether just how central the Israeli-Palestinian issue is in U.S. foreign policy is one of considerable debate. But there's no question that in recent years, the issue has fallen off the agenda, not just in the US, but also in Europe and even in the Arab states. I think that's the real kind of tectonic shift in this whole situation, is Palestine has been at the core of Arab public and political consensus for decades. There are very few issues on which, all Arab states agree on, and historically Palestine is probably the only one. They're very divided on so many other issues, right? Iraq, Syria, Iran, how to deal with dissent internally. all these things, but the Palestine issue is one that commanded consensus for decades. So there's no question that the issue has fallen off the agenda on a really global level. And I think there's a lot of reasons for this. The U.S. was bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, but especially the changes that we've seen in the region since 2011, the various Arab uprisings, the civil wars in Syria and Yemen, and as part of that, we've seen an increasingly active Iran in the region that has piqued everyone's interest. So there are lots of issues that are much more pressing in terms of the geopolitical situation in the region. That's even before we get to Russia and Ukraine and China and so many other global priorities that are taking up so much American and European and other bandwidth. Then you also have, I think, the internal situations, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, that are contributing to this, but in very opposite directions. So you've got this political dysfunction on the Palestinian side, total stagnation and paralysis, and increasing weakness. And then on the Israeli side, almost the exact opposite, just sort of, a sense of triumphalism, the ascendancy of the Israeli right. And so all of these things have made a resolution to the conflict much harder. And so it's just much easier to put it off and then put it aside.
And I think, there have been presidents who have tried to do that in the past. It always seems to, come back and find a way of engaging them in one way or another. And typically that's when there's conflict. What I really wanted to invite you for is because of your book, The Blind Spot. And it really is one of the few comprehensive historical analysis that I've read of the U.S. relationship with the Palestinians specifically. And I think through taking that lens, it really helps us see some of the dysfunction and some of the problems in the whole entirety of the peace process in a really different way. And so what I'd really like to do is go back, not so much to the beginning, but to an important key point, and ask you, when was it that the U.S. first got involved with the question of Palestine? Was it in 1947 with the partition resolution, or was it even before that?
I would say it was probably before that. It depends on what kind of involvement we're talking about. I mean, the U.S. has always been involved in the issue in different ways. Going back to the very beginning, to the Balfour Declaration, which of course was not an American declaration, but there was intensive American involvement in the crafting of that declaration, at least on the part of American Jews and the American Jewish community. They were heavily involved. And even if you go back to, it was almost exactly 100 years ago, in 1922, there was a congressional hearing on the Balfour Declaration. And it was pretty intensive. It was a 4-day congressional hearing in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. There were, I forget now, maybe something like 20 witnesses, including several members of Congress who testified. About half were for, half were against. It was a pretty balanced hearing, although the vote itself was pretty skewed. In any case, this sort of marked the beginning of American political involvement in the issue, even though the U.S. was not the primary actor in Palestine. That, of course, was the British. Yeah, the British were directly ruling the country up until 1948. But American involvement increases, and I think it's really by the 1940s that the U.S. becomes the main actor in Palestine, and it's just as the British power is waning, the British Empire is collapsing, but also Britain is very weakened by World War II. and the U.S. is kind of the emerging superpower now on the scene in the post-World War II era. So the U.S. plays a very intensive role starting really in the 1940s, and you see that play out in the partition plan drama that unfolded in 1947. And the relationship undergoes lots of different, there are two kinds of involvement. There's the kind, diplomatic involvement, things like a peace process or mediation. And then there's American support for the Zionist project and Israel. And that's the two eventually sort of bleed into each other and they impact one another. But American involvement is always pretty intensive, I think, from the 40s onward. In the 1960s, we see that deepen into a special relationship between the United States and Israel. And then in the early 70s, the United States becomes the main mediator in the conflict, whereas before it was an important player, but it was within the context of United Nations mediation. So it's, there's this sort of gradual escalation of the U.S. role to where it is now.
How do you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to talk a little bit about the partition, but you go ahead.
Well, I wanted to, ask like how, when the U.S. was getting involved, particularly in the question of partition and that whole partition process and, the UN Special Commission on Palestine, how was the United States looking at the conflict? How were they perceiving it?
I think the answer depends on who you ask, right? Which Americans are we talking about?
The administration, and the State Department,
Yeah, so there's different views even within the administration. If you're looking at the Truman era in particular, this was, the Truman presidency was, Truman is seen as the midwife of the Israeli state because it was his support for partition that sort of carried the day in 1947. But in the lead up to that vote in November of 1947, there was an intensive debate inside the administration. The State Department was very much, the consensus within the State Department was opposed to partition because the fear, and this was also true of the intelligence community more broadly, who feared that, we don't want to alienate the Arab states and leave the door open for Soviet encroachment in the region. This was a major preoccupation of the foreign policy and national security establishment in the 1940s and beyond. But the White House had a different view. The White House was looking at political considerations. 1948 was an election year. Of course, Truman is up for re-election, and they have a different political calculus. And so there really are there's a kind of dissonance. There's two different approaches to the issue that are living sort of simultaneously inside this administration. And so there is an inherent tension between them. And so what ends up happening on partition, a lot of people don't realize this. You think of Truman, was pushing hard for partition against the State Department, and on the advice of his White House advisors, who were listening a great deal to American Jewish groups and Zionist, lobbying interests. But Truman himself was actually conflicted. And you see that play out in the way Truman dealt with partition. He put a lot of pressure when he heard from his White House advisors on his State Department to push for partition at the UN during the vote. He got pushback from them, and at one point they there was almost a mass resignation because of the kinds of pressure Truman was putting on them to go against what they saw as American interests. And then immediately after the partition vote, after the US managed to convince a number of key countries to vote in favor of partition that allowed that resolution to pass, almost immediately after that, fighting broke out and Truman regretted his decision. And so he flip-flopped. He, at the advice of the State Department, opposed partition and sort of backed away from the partition idea. And the State Department was pushing this idea of a UN trusteeship that would take over after the British left in May of 1948, instead of partitioning into two separate states. So you have this flip-flopping, and then of course, when Israel declared its independence on May 14th, 1948, he immediately recognized it. So Truman himself kind of flip-flopped. That, I talk about it as ambivalence in my book. That's not a very sexy term. I mean, but there is this kind of dissonance that lives inside of, that is almost programmed in the American policymaking DNA.
Yeah.
And that you see it right up until this day. There's one set of interests that it says XYZ is good for the peace process. It's good for US national security interests. But then there are these other considerations, political considerations, ideological considerations, that push in a different direction. And the story of American mediation in this conflict is very much a story of these contradictions and this dissonance happening within US policy.
It's so interesting that you point out that sort of, back and forth with the State Department, and also that turnaround with Truman as soon as the, partition falls apart and fighting ensues, because it reflects that broader dissonance that was within the UN Special Commission on Palestine itself. I mean, if you really go into the weeds and read the documentary record and then, the negotiating record, you really see that people really didn't think partition was that great an idea in terms of conflict resolution. But, like in India and Pakistan at the time, it was sort of seen as the most efficient way to get the British Empire out, or get, the British out of these mandatory trusteeships that were left over from the League of Nations, but also a way to fulfill the national aspirations of both people. After the fighting, after the War of 1948, of course, you've got Palestinian exodus, 750,000 Palestinians are outside. And the United States actually plays a role in the mediation of the ceasefire and the earliest attempts. I mean, I love, one of those little best trivia things is one of the first African-American diplomats or foreign statesmen for the United States was Ralph Bunche, who went and, did a lot of the mediation of those early talks. Can you talk a little bit about his approach and what happened in that critical period between 1949 and 1951?
Yeah, so the focus after 1948 was the United States and the West were, their mindset was, look, Israel is a political fait accompli. It's not going to be reversed. And I should just point out, the whole idea of partition was never really about, it was not really a two-state solution, right? There's supposed to be a Jewish state and an Arab state, but the idea of partition was really about creating a Jewish state. The Arab part of that partition, the Palestinian state part of that partition, was never a priority, and in fact was completely ignored. Well before 1948, the British and the Zionists, with American approval, had already decided there would be no, along with the Jordanians, there would be no Arab state in Palestine. Jordan would take over whatever was left from Israel's conquest of the area. And so there was this kind of collusion to ensure that there was never going to be a Palestinian state. That's different. And so the reason I mention that is because there wasn't really an idea of an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There was an Arab-Israel conflict. There was an Arab-Zionist conflict. And it was a conflict between states. The Palestinians were just an unfortunate byproduct, collateral damage, if you will. There really even wasn't a notion of Palestinians as a people until much later from the outside world. For Palestinians, it was different. It was a different experience, obviously. But so the focus of Ralph Bunche and the international community was on getting ceasefire agreements between Israel and each of the Arab combatant states. So Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. There would be these kind of bilateral ceasefire agreements within this multilateral framework in Lausanne and in Rhodes. And that was sort of the origin of the peace process. That was the first peace process. The Palestinians weren't really on the agenda except as, you know, the Arab refugees or the Palestine refugees. That was the extent of it. And that was one of the major agenda items in those negotiations, but it wasn't a conflict in the way we see it between these two distinct national groups. And so, you know, what are we going to do with this refugee problem? How many of them are going to go back to their homes, and how many should be resettled in neighboring countries? And so the two bases of the peace process back then were two UN resolutions. General Assembly Resolution 181, which was the partition resolution that created the Jewish state, right? That's the birth certificate for the state of Israel. And the second was Resolution 194, which dealt with the refugees and specifically allowed for their right to return to their homes. So the peace process was about, how do we deal with the refugees? What are Israel's defined borders? We have to agree between, you know, on a bilateral and multilateral level. And how do you deal with thorny issues like the future of Jerusalem? Because Jerusalem was divided between the Jordanian-controlled side and the Israeli-controlled side. But it wasn't the way we think of the peace process today, where the Palestinians were an agent. They were not considered an agent.
Is it fair to say that the peace equation in that period, 1949-52, was, instead of land for peace, was refugees for peace? Sort of, you know, dealing with the humanitarian in exchange for defined borders. Is that fair?
Yeah, it was refugees, and I would say recognition. Yeah. In the sense of the goal of the Americans, of the UN effort in general, and certainly the Israelis, was to get the Arab states to recognize Israel, to come to terms with Israel formally, right? Which didn't happen. You had only these ceasefire agreements. You know, there was just these were kind of demarcation lines of forces, right? They weren't recognized boundaries between sovereign states. They became de facto that after, you know, they became recognized as that by the international community, minus the Arab world, right? The Arab states refused to recognize Israel in any capacity. It was it did not accept the fact of Israel's existence. So I would say there were the two parts. Yes, peace for refugees, but refugees in a humanitarian sense, how do we deal with them? There wasn't, even though Resolution 194 said that all refugees have the right to return to their homes, that wasn't necessarily the focus of the diplomatic effort, because Israel was adamantly opposed to allowing any refugees. And that was a consistent position. It was not going to allow, it wouldn't even talk about compensation for, you know, Israel seized all of the refugees' properties with no compensation. It would not discuss the return of any refugees or compensation for the refugees. That was a major source of frustration for Ralph Bunche, but also for the Truman administration,
Mhm.
for the international community in general, which was quite, Truman himself had some very choice words for the Israelis in that moment.
It wasn't necessarily a priority of the Arab states, though. I mean, wasn't that also part of the challenge there? Was the US was trying to solve this conflict on a state-to-state basis, but the return of refugees, other than dealing with the humanitarian side of things, really wasn't that big of a priority for the Arabs. Is that fair?
I think it was a priority because the presence of a very large number of refugees was highly destabilizing, especially for small countries like Jordan and Lebanon, in part because of the demographic changes that entailed. Lebanon itself was a very precarious balancing act of these different sects. And so now you've got this large influx of mostly Muslim Palestinians, right? The small minority of Christians that tips the demographic balance in Lebanon against the Christian. At that time, it was sort of a 50-50 split in Lebanon between Christians and Muslims, and this precarious power sharing arrangement. And then you have a country like Jordan, where the presence of refugees outnumbered the number of East Bank Jordanians, and so that created a different dynamic, right? Because now you've got a national group whose focus and priorities are across the border, but who are now residing in your country. So it's a strain on your resources, but it's also opens the country up because Jordan and Lebanon become the bases for future guerrilla activity against Israel. So it was a priority, I think, for the Arab states. They very much wanted the refugees to go back home for their own domestic reasons, but also nationalistic reasons.
And I'm glad you pointed out the instability in Lebanon, but also in Jordan, because a lot of that Fedayeen activity in the early 60s and late 60s was what eventually got us to the War of 1967. And we have that war. Israel takes more territory, takes the West Bank from Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and of course, East Jerusalem. And at that point, the UN is still involved in the peace process, but the United States becomes much more involved. Did the US approach to settling the Arab-Israeli conflict at this point change after 1967, or was it still really the same framework that they were applying at that point?
No, I think it changed very dramatically. I think it is it's a cliche. 1967 was a major flashpoint. It was a major inflection point in the conflict for the history of the region, for the geopolitics of the region. And that also transformed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and by extension, the nature of the peace process, right? If the conflict itself has changed, then the way you go about resolving it must also change. And so the focus shifted away from refugees, right? So the 1950s and to a lesser extent 60s, there was a fair amount of urgency about dealing with the refugee issue. Every U.S. president, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, dealt with the issue. Lyndon Johnson was the exception. By the time you get to Lyndon Johnson, it's just not a priority, right? It's almost the whole generation has gone by now, even though it's less than 20 years, and it's just not a priority. So the shift, by the time 1967 comes, the focus shifts away from the refugees and toward a territorial settlement between these sovereign states, between Israel and its Arab neighbors, because now, as you pointed out, it's not just Palestine that's been overtaken. The West Bank and Gaza being the last remaining areas that weren't under Israeli control before 67, but now are. But also you've got Egyptian and Syrian territory that is lost, their own sovereign territory to Israel and Israel's occupation. And so now you have a new formula that enters the diplomatic discourse, and that is land for peace. The UN Security Council Resolution 242 becomes the new terms of reference. So in the old peace process, it was 181 and 194. In the new peace process, it's Resolution 242, which is about land for peace. And again, the Palestinians are not an agent in this dynamic. They're not a party to the conflict in the perception of the bulk of the international community after 1967. But 67 triggers a kind of new awareness, not just on the part of Palestinians. There's a sense of we have to take matters into our own hands, but also by extension, the world starts to pay more attention to Palestinians because they become autonomous actors on the scene in both political and, I would say, military or paramilitary terms, in ways that kind of forces the issue on the agenda. So 67 changes everything, really.
Sometimes I wonder, I mean, 67 definitely does change everything. But as you said, I think in terms of starting to change US perceptions of who they have to deal with in order to come to some sort of a resolution or at least manage the conflict. Not necessarily 1967, but maybe 1970. And then certainly with the onset of the war in Lebanon, it becomes really clear that, the Palestinians are an actor. My question, I mean, at the official level, the US presidents are taking that state-based approach. You see that with Nixon, you see that with Carter. When did the US administration start to not only recognize that they need to deal with the Palestinians directly or in some fashion, but also start to engage with them? And when I say the Palestinians here, I'm talking about the PLO. Was there anything particular that triggered the policy shift? And did that engagement sort of lead to a paradigm shift in terms of how the US administration understood the conflict?
Yeah, I think it's really 1973 is another, I don't want to overuse the term, but another inflection point. 1973 is another major marker where it's really after the 1973 war, ironically, because the Palestinians are not involved at all. This is a war initiated by Egypt and Syria against Israel to try to recapture their occupied territory, not to liberate Palestine. But it's after 1973 that the Palestinians land very forcefully onto the international agenda. But it's set up in the period between 67 and 73. There's a lot that happens in that period. And so there's this kind of growing awareness. The first thing that happens really, the Palestinian guerrilla fighters sort of emerge on the scene, right, in 1968, headed by groups like Fatah under the leadership of Yasser Arafat. And then by late 68, early 1969, these guerrilla groups take over the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. So the PLO before that was not an autonomous Palestinian entity. It was a creation of the Arab states to try to give representation to the Palestinians, but also to control the Palestinian movement, mainly by Egypt. In 1969, the Palestinians take over the PLO. They make it an autonomous Palestinian entity. And so now the Palestinians have entered the arena as agents pursuing their own agenda, of course, as a non-state actor. So the intelligence community is very keen to pick up on this, and they start to advocate, well, maybe we need to reach out to the PLO. Maybe we need to start talking to people in the PLO. And the CIA starts a dialogue with the PLO in 1969. And that becomes a very, very critical piece of US-Palestinian relations as a channel for not just intelligence sharing, but also for kind of quasi-political dialogue. A lot of people in the Foreign Service, in the State Department, particularly those serving in Arab states, come to similar conclusion. We have to start talking to the PLO. There is, by the time 1973 comes along, it is the consensus inside the foreign policy establishment, with one very significant exception, and that is Henry Kissinger, who is adamantly opposed to any consideration of the Palestinian issue. The Palestinians are a refugee issue at best. At worst, they're a terrorism problem or a guerrilla problem. He had no patience for those advocating, we need to talk to the PLO. And that view carried the day, even though it was the minority view inside the Foreign Service and the State Department apparatus. It carried the day because he was Secretary of State, and a very powerful one at that. And he had very particular ideas about how the peace process should be structured that had nothing to do with the roots of the conflict, and it had a lot more to do with American strategic interests vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but also in terms of maintaining American power and preeminence. This was how he structured the peace process. Wasn't really about conflict resolution. So in a way, even though the Palestinians were now on the agenda, and by 1975, they're recognized at the United Nations, or I should say by 1974, it sort of delays their incorporation into the peace process because of Kissinger's opposition. And of course, Israel's opposition. Part of Kissinger's opposition is because he knows the Israelis will never go for this. So it's a non-starter. So we shouldn't even talk about the PLO. The Israelis didn't even recognize a entity or a group called Palestinians. You remember Golda Meir's famous quote, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. This is the origin of the invented people narrative, right? They're not a real people. They're just unfortunate refugees who are Arab. But, Palestine is not a nation and it's not a nationality. So it's really not until Carter comes along that he's much more receptive to the Palestinian issue. He's more attuned. He's more focused on things like human rights in general. And so he talks about a Palestinian homeland for the first time. That sends shockwaves across the, not just in Israel, but across the region. We went from Kissinger, who would not countenance any sort of dealing with the Palestinians, to Carter talking about a Palestinian homeland and bringing the Palestinians into the peace process. But he couldn't because Kissinger had tied his hands.
Yeah, and in the end, what Carter achieves is something that Kissinger would have been very pleased with, which is, a separate state-to-state peace agreement between Israel and Egypt.
Which, by the way, has a lot to do with the way Kissinger structured the peace process. He was very keen to institutionalize it in a way that not only prevented Carter from bringing the PLO in, because he's had this secret deal with the Israelis, this memorandum of agreement in which the US agreed never to talk to the PLO until they met certain conditions, which were eventually enshrined into US law, but also in structuring the sequence of the peace process. You would start with Egypt, then Syria and Jordan, and then at the very end, you deal with the Palestinian issue after the PLO has been weakened. And so Carter was sort of hamstrung into, it was like a straitjacket that he had to fit into, despite his own preference for a different kind of approach.
We could spend hours talking about this period, just like we could about 48 and 49, because there's so much there. But this consistent theme of dissonance within the US administration. How do we deal with the Palestinians? Don't we deal with the Palestinians? We get through 73, through the war in Lebanon, and then the first Intifada breaks out, and we get to the first George Bush administration. And, I remember this period very strongly, and I've talked to a lot of, diplomats and analysts over the years who have said that there was something unique about George H.W. Bush and James Baker and their approach to the process, that they were able to create, well, first of all, they were able to get the Israelis and Palestinians to the table together, and then create some sort of a space for dialogue and engagement on some of the key issues, and actually, start a momentum. In fact, I even heard one former diplomat say that, James Baker, I guess, famously said on a plane ride, if we win the election, we're going to come back with a few peace agreements, except I don't think we're going to win the election, right? Is there anything to that in your research or assessment? Was the Bush administration kind of on the right track?
Yeah, of course, it's always hard with counterfactual.
Well, yeah,
but
they're fun.
It is absolutely, and it's something that I think every scholar or analyst has to contend with. And I think I would agree. I think the approach that Bush, and especially his Secretary of State James Baker, took really stood out. It was unlike anything we'd seen before, especially from the Reagan years. Reagan years were, even though ironically Reagan was the first president to open an official dialogue with the PLO, but they really kept the PLO at arm's length throughout the 1980s, even after the debacle of Lebanon, when the U.S. was brokering for the first time between Israel and the PLO via third parties, because they were not allowed to talk directly to the PLO. Even when that collapsed and failed and led to this massacre in refugee camps in Lebanon by pro-Israel Lebanese militias, they generally, there was massive pressure from the State Department to bring the PLO, but they kept them at arm's length. So the Bush administration coming in, and they weren't ready to accept the PLO because they were still confined by the old Kissinger policy, which was now written into US law, that you couldn't talk to the PLO until they met these three conditions. They had to recognize Israel, accept resolutions 242 and 338, and renounce terrorism. It took a long time for the PLO to be able to meet those, jump through those hoops. And they did eventually, and the George H.W. Bush administration inherited a kind of dysfunctional dialogue with the PLO. But what made Baker different was, one, he was willing to bring the Palestinians into the process in real ways. So they couldn't talk to the PLO, but they could talk to people who were close to the PLO. And there was a whole negotiating team that everybody knew was appointed and signed off on by the PLO leadership, but who couldn't write on PLO letterhead, couldn't have business cards that said PLO, because that was against US law to talk to the PLO. But everybody knew they were PLO. And Baker had a real dialogue with them. And if you read, Hanan Ashrawi, probably one of the most famous Palestinian spokespeople, ever. She's written a number of books. In her book, This Side of Peace, she goes into great length in talking about how Baker was different. And Baker was the first person to really humanize Palestinians and talk to them as equals, and as not just parties to the conflict. That was obvious, but as equals. And that made a difference. But also the other thing I would say is the focus that the administration had on international law, specifically when it came to Israeli settlements. The Reagan administration kind of took a wishy-washy view of settlements. Well, they're not illegal, like Carter was saying, but we don't like them. They're still an obstacle to peace. The Bush administration took a pretty hard stance on settlements and said, they even put pressure on Israel in terms of trying to get them to freeze Israeli settlements, and was willing to leverage for the first time America's aid package to Israel in pursuit of that goal. So those things, I think, really made the administration stand out, particularly compared with not just what came before, but what would come after. It was a very different dynamic under Clinton.
Which brings us to Oslo, and I'm going to try to sort of consolidate some of these questions, but I do think it's important. Oslo is the process that everyone loves to hate. Everyone assumes it was, doomed from the beginning. I was in Jerusalem at the very beginning of the process, and the atmosphere on the ground was actually one of hope, and people really believed there was going to be a settlement. In fact, they were so clear there was going to be a settlement that they would sit there and tell you in no uncertain terms how terrible the settlement was going to be, right? They were going to get screwed this way or that way. Israeli-Palestinian didn't matter. And that really indicated this belief that we were going to get this deal done. Rabin is assassinated. This is sort of the stereotypical turning point, the beginning of the end of the peace process. Do you think his assassination was that significant, or were there structural problems in that agreement and or the U.S. facilitation of that agreement that really prevented it from realizing the promise that people on the ground really, I think, genuinely believed it had?
Yeah, I think both. I think it was definitely a major inflection point, and also there were deeper structural problems. I'm not deterministic in my thinking. I don't think anything was necessarily doomed to happen or doomed to fail. I think if certain decisions had been made differently, we could have had very different outcomes. And that's certainly true of the Oslo process, even though I was a grad student at the time at Georgetown, and I was probably one of those skeptics who was saying, yeah, I don't think this is going to work out. This sounds a lot like, the Carter autonomy, the Camp David autonomy plan. And it basically it was just sort of, cribbed from the old Camp David Accords. Which really shows you how weakened the PLO had become to agree to something that they had totally rejected many years earlier. But that's not to say that it was doomed to fail. I think that what doomed it to fail, it had these structural limitations. Well, first of all, on the Rabin question, I think that Rabin, I think his assassination was a game changer. We didn't know it at the time, right? Because nobody could predict what was going to happen. But when you look back at it, Rabin was really probably one of the last, maybe the last Israeli leader who had the gravitas, who had the domestic legitimacy. He was a decorated general. He could never be accused of being a peacenik like Shimon Peres, right? He was the guy who was the author of the break their bones policy during the first Palestinian uprising. So he was no pushover. But that gave him, I think, the credibility as an Israeli leader to make a conflict-ending peace deal, right? He had come to the conclusion that we have to come to terms as Israelis with Palestinian nationalism, with the, not necessarily, he wasn't convinced of the goal of a Palestinian state, but he understood we need to find an accommodation. And he evolved. And had he not been killed, I could see his evolution continuing, right? He might have gotten to a point where he could accept a Palestinian state. I think certainly the Clinton administration had also evolved in that direction, and they might have helped it along. But I think his murder sort of solidified a trend. I mean, you realize just how precarious his position was, the fact that, you know, someone went out of their way to, you know, plan this murder, and then went to a peace rally where he was speaking and then shot him and killed him, right? And changed the trajectory of history. And I think it was that moment also that gave rise, you know, we've really seen the ascendancy of the Israeli right since then. I think that was the moment when, apart from a few blips in the, you know, the Barak period was very short-lived in the late 90s and early 2000s. And then you had the centrists of Kadima and Olmert and Sharon in, you know, later on. But the story of Israeli politics really since then has been one of very, very steady drift to the right, pretty defined, with a few, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of a dynamic. And if you look at the current makeup of the incoming Israeli government, these are people who hailed Yitzhak Rabin's murderer as a hero. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is likely to be in the government, who is a avowed Jewish supremacist and himself has terrorist origins, right? The Kahana movement is a terrorist organization that he comes from. He boasts about how he has the emblem of the Cadillac of Rabin's limousine, and he would say, "If I can steal the emblem, we can get. If I can get to the emblem, we can get to Rabin." So these are, you know, fellow travelers of Yigal Amir who killed Rabin, who are now on the ascendancy in Israeli politics. So I think it is a pretty pivotal moment.
I think one of the things that I remember about Rabin specifically that I think is important is, you know, the Oslo Accords were prefaced on the idea that Arafat could control the violence, right? And if you know anything about civil conflict and the settlement of, you know, internal armed conflict, peace agreements never end violence, right? But when you'd have these incidents of violence, he would come on the radio in his, you know, gravelly, cigarette-induced Hebrew and say, look, this is terrible, this hurts, this is, you know, whatever, but we knew this was going to happen, and this is why we have to press forward. And he would say that every single time. And, you know, you're exactly right. I remember, you know, Bibi coming up, this is before he was prime minister, and making these speeches that were really sort of, you know, the precursor for what we're seeing today, and really set that trajectory in motion. I want to make sure that we get to our audience questions. So I kind of want to ask you one final question, and then we'll turn to the audience. Our mutual friend, Laura Friedman, president of the Foundation of Middle East Peace, she made this joke once that I think was quite apt about the peace process being Schrodinger's cat, right? Is it alive? Is it dead? Is it both? It looks like it's dead from everything that we see on the ground and everything that you just said, but everybody keeps talking about it like it's alive, especially, you know, diplomats and statesmen. Can we say the same thing about the two-state solution? Is the two-state solution now Schrodinger's cat, in that it's only alive because people keep saying it's an option?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about politics and diplomacy. Something is because we believe it to be so. And reality, it's all very subjective. But on the first question of the peace process, let me just eliminate any sort of doubt. The peace process is definitely, absolutely, positively, unequivocally dead, and in fact has been
very dead.
for many years. I mean, people now are coming to realize that. I've been saying the peace process is dead since at least 2012. And a lot of people would say, oh, the peace process is like rock and roll. It'll never die. And now those same people acknowledge that, yes, the peace process is in fact dead. And it's obvious that it's dead. There's no mechanism for conflict mitigation or conflict resolution, right? There are no confidence building measures. There's no process at all, and there's no peace. So all we see is violence, periodic violence that erupts. Sometimes people try to intervene. The Egyptians do this, the Americans do that, the Europeans or the Turks do that. But there isn't a process to try to contain or mitigate violence, much less to produce an agreement that will put an end to the deeper conflict. So the peace process is definitely dead. The question of whether a two-state solution is dead is in a way maybe more of a philosophical question. It is only dead if people believe it to be so, right? So this is a question that I ask people all the time. How do you know? When will you know? Like, I'll just give you an example. A lot of people are fond of saying things like, John Kerry said this when he was Secretary of State. The window is closing on a two-state solution. Okay, or the clock is running out, right? Whatever metaphor you want to use. All right, how will you know when the clock strikes midnight? What are the signs, the tangible, measurable signs that will say, aha, it's 11:59. And now the clock is about to strike and the two-state solution will be over. There isn't such a thing, right? At least no one can point to it, right? Because any fact on the ground you point to, well, there's 700,000 Israeli settlers. Well, settlements can be reversed. We saw that in 2005 when Israel removed settlers from Gaza. So how will you know? To me, the test is a two-state solution dies when nobody wants it anymore, at least when the main stakeholders no longer want it. So if you look at the Israeli side is post two-state solution. There's no question about it. Even under the previous very eclectic, unstable government of Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, supposedly a center-right coalition of some sort. Lapid talked about a two-state solution. Bennett was opposed to it. But you look at where the Israeli public is very far. The Israeli electorate is very far to the right. The Israeli Knesset is dominated, not just has a right-wing majority government, but has a supermajority, a right-wing supermajority in the parliament. So Israel is definitely past two-state solution. Palestinians are well on their way, right? The younger generation of Palestinians, they don't want a two-state solution. They want equal rights, more increasingly, right? They don't have a clear definition of what that would look like, much less an organization or movement to push for it. But they look around them and they grew up during Oslo and they say this is a failed experiment and we're done. We just want to be citizens of a state, whatever you want to call it. We just want to be equal citizens. Even on the American side, one of the two major parties in this country has explicitly rejected, has now officially renounced a two-state solution, right? The Republican Party is on record officially opposing a two-state solution. In 2016, the Republican National Platform says that pretty explicitly. So it's not a coincidence that the plan that Donald Trump pushes is not really about a two-state solution, but about consecrating the one state separate and unequal reality that exists on the ground. So does that mean it? I think a two-state. The answer to your question is a two-state solution is theoretically possible, but as a practical matter, it's virtually dead. It's not actually dead. In part because look, it doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
If the Biden administration tomorrow says, "Holy crap, we have to start working for a two-state solution. We're going to do X, Y, and Z," then maybe they could. But that requires doing things like putting pressure on Israel.
Yeah.
That is something that this administration is dogmatically opposed to doing. And that entails, a potential political cost that no one wants to undertake. So it's a kind of philosophical question.
Right.
The two-state solution is alive, but nobody wants to do anything necessary to achieve it. Yeah. And so that's where we are.
Yep. And I think, even if the Biden administration was sort of to wake up, fall out of bed, hit their head, and all of a sudden put pressure and say they were going to go for it, then you also have to look at who's the Palestinian leader who's going to deliver.
There's a lot of water under the bridge.
Right. And
it
so,
only gets harder. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. We've got a few audience questions here that I want to make sure we honor here. So Allie Hawkins up in Waterville, she's saying you discussed how Palestinians via the PLO were able to dialogue with the CIA, the Department of State. Are these channels still there? And, I think security cooperation and coordination is still there, right? And if so, is that form of Palestinian engagement with the US government an actual dialogue? And how else can Palestinians make their voices heard in the current climate, particularly in the current moment, particularly in this political climate?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack in the question. So the dialogue, the CIA dialogue in particular has been on again, off again for almost 50 years, and is probably I would describe it as kind of the backbone of the U.S.-Israel relationship. It has always been premised on security cooperation, intelligence sharing. The PLO shared lots of important counterterrorism intelligence with the Americans in the 80s and the 90s and beyond. So the U.S. the PLO was a very valuable asset in those terms, but it's also, I think, central to the current relationship, which has always been premised on security, i.e. Israeli security. So the security and intelligence relationship is the core of U.S.-Palestinian relations. The diplomatic and political part of that has been more patchy, right? So, in the 70s, we didn't have a political dialogue with the PLO because they weren't allowed. Right. Also in the 1980s. But the CIA had that channel, that clandestine channel that could relay information, as well as other third parties. After Oslo, that changes, right? Because Oslo then normalizes the relationship between the PLO and Israel. Israel recognizes the PLO, and by extension, the U.S. has no reason not to recognize the PLO. So the U.S. accepts the PLO. Bill Clinton embraces Yasser Arafat in a sense. He hosts him at the White House something like a dozen times over the course of the Oslo process. And there's this kind of budding bilateral relationship, right? There's free trade agreements, and there's, President Clinton goes to Bethlehem and Gaza on what looked like to everyone a state visit, right? Yeah. And he was, Arafat was kind of treated as a head of state, all in preparation for what people thought was going to be this inevitable Palestinian state at the end of the road, that, obviously didn't materialize. And so that there's been constant diplomatic political relationship over the years since Oslo, with the exception of briefly during the Second Intifada when Yasser Arafat became persona non grata and the U.S. cut ties with him because they saw him as, fomenting terror and whatever. That lasted up until his death. But now you have, after 2005, you have a new Palestinian leadership. So there was always direct political dialogue. And there was, up until recently, a PLO embassy in Washington until Donald Trump shut it down in 2017. So this is part of the problem, is Congress, on the one hand, has been trying to, pro-Israel forces in Congress, I should say, have been trying to close the PLO embassy down in Washington practically since it opened. And so they finally succeeded under the Trump administration. So you have these impediments that are put in place to a dialogue by the pro-Israel lobby, by the Congress, that directly affect the bilateral relationship. I don't have the data research done, but what I am comfortable saying anecdotally is that there is probably no single group, foreign group, that is under more sanctions internationally than the Palestinians, with the possible exception of Russia since the Ukraine war, and maybe Iran. But over the past, since the 1970s, 80s, 90s, all through the Oslo process, the story that you don't see in the headlines are all of the laws that are passed and all of the sanctions that are imposed on Palestinians throughout the peace process and after the peace process. All of these are designed to restrict the US PLO dialogue and to delegitimize the Palestinian leadership and to denormalize American acceptance of the Palestinian leadership. And so it's part of this dissonance. On the one hand, you've got presidents dealing with Palestinian leaders. President Biden goes to Bethlehem to see President Abbas, but at the same time, the PLO has no embassy in Washington, and in fact, by law, cannot open up their embassy in Washington, and there is no US consulate in Jerusalem. And there are a host of sanctions, or a host of things that the Palestinians cannot do. A Palestinian official cannot come to Washington because it would trigger all these, sanctions as a result of US law. So that dissonance obviously affects the relationship and affects American effectiveness as a mediator.
So I'm going to try to figure out how to squeeze a couple of these questions together because we are running out of time.
Yes, I'll be shorter.
Well, you can't just say one word about these things because it's, the most complex and complicated issue out there. So, Palestinians have struggled to get their voices heard. People here in the US, you call up your congressman, you call up your senator, you say, hey, look, address this issue. What about Palestinian rights? And get nowhere. It's clearly impacting the peace process. So is there any kind of grassroots effort that could be mobilized in the United States? And is that kind of grassroots effort what might to change how the US administration engages with the Palestinians? Might that be what is necessary to actually get us to the beginning of a viable peace process that would lead to a more peaceful and secure future for the Palestinians and for the Israelis? How's that?
Yeah.
I put three of them together.
That's excellent the way you did that. And I'll try to be as concise. So it's a very good question, and I think this is another story that isn't necessarily getting out there. But at the same time, we're talking about, in a way, doom and gloom. The peace process is dead. Two-state solution is dead. The Palestinian leadership is dysfunctional, totally inept, and yet, on the upside of this, there has been a real shift in how ordinary Americans look at and understand this issue.
Yeah.
And that it's a shift that's happened in public opinion really across the board, whatever demographic you look at. But it is especially concentrated in what we might call, traditionally liberal constituencies, young people, people of color, disproportionately female, and where all of these intersect, of course, are even higher concentrations. And so it's to the point now where the Democratic Party rank and file is by a 2-to-1 margin, and you have to understand where public opinion was in the past.
Yep.
Public opinion, whatever poll you look at, is solidly pro-Israel. Who do you
Yep.
sympathize with, Israelis or Palestinians? It is going to be 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 in favor of Israelis.
Yep.
Okay, that is shifting, but it is shifting in a way that's very polarized. So Republicans are becoming more hostile toward Palestinians and more pro-Israel. Democrats are becoming more pro-Palestinian and more critical of Israel.
Yeah.
And it's now where rank and file Democrats, you poll them 2-to-1, say, we sympathize more with Palestinians than with Israelis. Just a generation ago, it was the exact reverse, right?
Yep.
The two parties, but there's a gap because
Right.
that's where the party rank and file is, but it's not where the party leadership is.
Right.
And so the public opinion is changing, and to an extent, the politics are starting to change. You've got Bernie Sanders, you've got Elizabeth Warren saying things that no viable presidential candidate has ever really said about Palestinians and Palestinian rights, and about criticisms of Israel. And you have a movement within especially the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So eventually that, but just to go back to the original question, I should have started with this. The answer is yes, there are, the reason you have this shift happening is because there's quite a lot of grassroots mobilization that has been going on for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
And it's Palestinian Americans, but also non-Palestinians and non-Arabs. There's a large contingent, even inside the Jewish community. You have Jewish groups. I mean, first of all, there are solidarity movements like Students for Justice in Palestine that have chapters pretty much in every university campus. You've got the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. You've got Jewish groups like If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace, and more centrist voices like J Street, who also, even though they describe themselves as pro-Israel, also often center Palestinian rights and are, unlike AIPAC, the traditional lobby, are critical of Israeli policies openly and vocally, and they're able to fundraise off of it, right? And the sky doesn't fall when they do those things. If you look at the last elections, just yesterday, right, was the election day. It feels like a year ago already, but AIPAC suffered some major defeats. They poured all kinds of money into defeating certain candidates who won quite handily. So the politics are shifting, but what isn't shifting is the policy.
Right.
And that gap is where there's a lot of space for debate and a lot of tension, and room for activism, and for someone like me, room to insert into the policy discourse a different kind of a different narrative.
Right.
But things are changing, I think, is the upside.
Yeah. I mean, I think the conversation is changing, and it certainly gives me hope. And, one of the things that people like you and Lauren and all of these voices that you've named have worked on, I think there's starting to also be an understanding that being in favor of Palestinian rights, or recognizing that the Palestinians are need to be a partner in this process is actually, I mean, Laura says this all the time, is actually the best way to be pro-Israeli. And that if you're really serious about Israeli security and the future of the state of Israel, you have to sort of recognize that this is an important part of the equation. Well, you and I could probably go on and talk about this for another 5 hours, but it is time. And I just, I want to thank you for being here and for engaging in this important conversation. I also want to thank this evening's sponsors, Jackie Dennis, John and Kathleen Sutherland, and Pat Finnegan. Thank you so much for your support. You're helping us make these programs available and free to Maine students all across the state. And I hope to see my World Affairs Council of Maine audience. I will see you hopefully on November 30th when we have Ambassador William Taylor coming up from Washington to give us some updates on his thoughts on the war in Ukraine. Khaled, again, thank you very much. Have a great evening.
You're welcome. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night, everyone.
Good night.